In this section, we're going to talk about assumption of stock options. Remember all those options that you gave to your employees as you were growing your company? They matter, and how you treat them in an acquisition has a big impact on what the employees are getting from the acquisition.
What are the possible things that can happen to an employee's stock options in an acquisition?
So there's a couple of specific things that happen. First, they can either be assumed by the acquirer or not. And the way the stock option agreements are written and the type of transaction you do has an impact on this. First and foremost, it depends whether or not the stock options have any value. In a lot of transactions, for example, a sale of the company that's below the liquidation preference, the investors would get all the money and the stock options don't have any value anyway. Or even in an upside case, some of the higher priced options might not have any value because they might be priced at a strike price above the transaction price. So first is understanding whether the options have value or not. Let's assume that the options have value. You still have this scenario where the buyer could be assuming the stock options or not. If they assume the stock options, there's a whole series of things that you have to understand around vesting. And in the stock option context, what happens with acceleration, who actually has their stock options, and what form of plan they turn into on the buyer side. If the buyer isn't assuming the stock options, then it's likely that the options are accelerating investing based on the way the plan works. And so the consideration is going to have to go to buy out the actual options in the plan. Although that's not always the case, because there are some situations where the options might cease to exist if they're not assumed.
So let's take the scenario where the options do have value. What's the motivation on the buyer side? Would they want to assume the options or not?
So again, it varies, and to some degree it's a negotiation. Most buyers view existing stock option plans as a retention dynamic for the existing employees in the company they're buying. When a company buys another company, oftentimes they want the people to stay with the acquired company for some period of time, sometimes as long as possible, other times for a year or two. Unvested stock options in the context of a plan assumption can be part of that retention. In other cases, a buyer views it as creating a retention pool that's separate from the stock option plan and doesn't really care about moving the stock option plan over, but instead wants to substitute the retention for the stock option plan. So fundamentally, it becomes somewhat of a negotiation at the time of the acquisition. 15 years ago, it was very hard because of the way accounting rules worked to change things at the time at which the acquisition happened. Today, it's actually quite easy to change things when the acquisition happens. That's why there's oftentimes this negotiation around assuming the stock options, using them as retention, or substituting some other type of retention pool for the stock options.
So as an entrepreneur selling my company, what would I want? What would be the best for my employees? To having us assumed or not?
Well, it depends on how you think about the stock options and the length of tenure of the company. So there are some entrepreneurs who, when the company's acquired, really want all of the options to accelerate because the people at the company at that moment in time they view as having really helped build the value up to that point. And then they view the retention as a separate piece. There are other entrepreneurs who very much view the stock options as future retention. The entrepreneurs, if they're staying with the company, also want those employees to stay with the company because the reason the company is being acquired is presumably to add upside on a go-forward basis. So as the entrepreneur, first and foremost, I think you have to have a philosophy about how you want them to be treated. But it's not your own decision. It's a decision that includes your investors because fundamentally anything you do with the stock options different than what the plan says is a change of the capital structure of the company. Some investors are going to be very dogmatic about getting every last penny for themselves in the context of the transaction. Many investors are going to be a lot more flexible as they look at the whole transaction and try to figure out what mechanisms they can use to maximize what's going on. Of course, if there's an earnout of any sort in the transaction, it's in the investor's interest to make sure that the team stays together to actually get that earnout. So there's even another layer of conversation around it when that is in place.